Hello, today is July 31st. This is SIG Cluster Lifecycle's main meeting. If folks have agenda items, please add them to the doc. Lubomir has pasted the agenda in the chat window. I do not have many things on the agenda for today. If folks wanted to add other things, that would be helpful. I think the first thing I had on the list was wordsmithing the charter. The reason for shared wordsmithing of the charter is just to make sure that we have the language right. A lot of folks have added comments, but I wanted to quick run through the charter with the group here and see if folks agree or disagree with some of the details there. So let me share my screen. Cluster life cycle. Okay, oops, nope, that's too much. I can't tell the scoping of the share. Do folks see the SIG cluster lifecycle charter, or do they see my whole screen?
The whole screen.
For some reason, sharing is not working here.
It was the whole window, the whole web browser. That seems okay.
Let me just do this one more time here. I don't know why Zoom's acting weird today. Okay, so they just see the web browser right now?
Yes.
That is it? All right, cool. Let's walk through the deets here, and if folks want to change things, please comment, speak up. Otherwise, we're gonna go with what we have here. SIG cluster lifecycle's objective is to improve the deployment, configuration management, and upgrade story of Kubernetes clusters and relevant infrastructure. I had a problem with the relevant infrastructure statement here, because I think we might want to put like some things are out of scope. Does anyone have comments there?
Well, we are already saying which things are out of scope below. Like, I mean, I saw a couple of charter PRs that got rejected because the first sentence is not enough. Like, they wanted more text in the scope section, and I think we already covered what is in scope and out of scope. But maybe we should add another sentence in at the start.
Well, the purpose of group wordsmithing is, if you got something, you gotta speak up. Because if you're looking for me to rephrase sentences, I am not your person. I'm a good idea person. I'm a terrible wordsmither. So the whole purpose of doing this together is to to facilitate your vernacular into the document.
So Tim, I think Chris Nova added this part, right? I'm guessing that it was added because if you look at something like what KubeUp does or what we need to do to make the test infrastructure go much less for end users, we do things like provision, load balancers when creating clusters, and provisioning VMs, right? If you look at what the scope of the cluster API, it's sort of that layer below kubadmin, right? On Lucas's layered diagram. Yeah. And my guess is that's what this is meant to cover. Is it's meant to cover like the first part of the sentence is sort of pieces that sort of kubadmin does, and the second part of the sentence is sort of the cluster API pieces. So I don't know if there's a better way to phrase that, but I'm guessing that that's why that part was added.
Yeah, I agree. The question is that I had in my head was, where does it stop, right? Like, because relevant infrastructure could include anything. Like you get your F5 configurations, you have like where does the boundary line, the cut line end, right? Because there's so much configuration that could go on beyond the scope of what we're trying to do that it's difficult to parse that sentence without encompassing a broader swath of potential solutions and infrastructure.
Is it a problem?
What?
Is it a problem to be not specific in the intro?
Yes, because you want to make sure your scope is bounded. So like SIG apps is a really bad example, a counterexample, where their scope is way too broad. So you want to know the purpose of the scope being focused enough is such that like when people are trying to hunt or the steering committee is trying to like, say who's responsible for what, it's clearly defined, the roles, right? So that way we don't have like SIGs. The problem we have currently is that there's a tremendous amount of SIG sprawl and there's a lot of overlap, and we want to dedupe the overlap, right?
So it's
sure. I just think that it's so a quick comment. We have a list of out of scope things. I think if we wanted to be, legally correct, it would take a lot more words. And I guess that was what I was saying, is that I don't think we have to be, we don't have to enumerate every single detail. Some amount of wiggle room is okay. Mm-hmm. Anyhow.
I'm okay with it if other people are okay with it. I just had a comment about it. Lubomir, you're going to say something?
I mean, relevant infrastructure. What is the infrastructure? It's about clusters.
Well, I think if you look at the cluster API, it's really sort of two things. It's machines, which I think is sort of a pretty common thing across all clusters. So all clusters are going to need some notion of machines. The other half, if you look at the cluster API, KEP is sort of nebulous. It says other infrastructure. And I think that that's meant to imply things like a load balancer, especially if you have an HA cluster and on a cloud platform, you want to put a load balancer in front of it. That's part of cluster provisioning. Disks for persistent storage of your etcd database, those sorts of things. So I think that's sort of the other infrastructure part. If we want to be more specific and maybe expand our scope later when those things become sort of clear what they are and what's consistent across platforms, we could say, we could sort of more focus on sort of the machines API part of the cluster API project and say, basically, the machines necessary to run Kubernetes or something here.
I think the statement is okay. Why don't we go on to the next bits? Like, I don't like it. So if people have an idea of how they'd want to phrase it better, I'm game for that. So it's okay in my mind, but it's not I'm sure, if I were to talk with my wife who's, like English lit / other background, she'd probably needle me to death. So, and next part is in scope work. The following topics fall under the ownership of the SIG. Improving the Kubernetes UX for cluster administration. That seems perfectly legit. But should we say explicitly that this does not include UI? Because that's a whole separate SIG, right? You might want to say that down below.
So do you put that in out of scope or do you put that here?
Out of scope.
We should probably add it to the out of scope section.
Yep. Does somebody want to do that while I'm
yes,
talking through?
Yeah.
That sounds great. Kubernetes SIG cluster lifecycle related features and issues. Yeah, that seems obvious. Tools that assist in bootstrapping, mutating, and upgrading Kubernetes clusters. That also seems fine. Kubernetes tools used for cluster and infrastructure management. That's one of those things that I think if we provide the UI portion exemption down below, that seems fine. Tools that assist in management of Kubernetes components configuration. That sentence makes my brain bleed. Does anyone have comments? Changes that think that is worthwhile to make?
The second to last one, is that actually any different from the third one, which is listed? I'm just curious what the difference is between the two.
They do overlap. You could just basically say this. Go ahead.
I think there's a distinction. To me, cluster and infrastructure management is concerned with the servers, the routers, the whatever that run the cluster, whereas bootstrapping, mutating, and upgrading refers to the control plane itself. but I don't quite have a way to express that distinction.
Should we say control plane here instead of Kubernetes clusters?
Yeah, something about it's the Kubernetes itself, not the things that run using Kubernetes, because that's our mandate, right? Like, we're not responsible for upgrading other people's apps.
Well, but
Yeah.
we're responsible for kubelet.
But that's a component. That's a control plane component. The kubelet is considered part of the control plane.
Okay.
Is the second to last one more about day two management as opposed to bootstrapping?
I think if you look at Justin Santa Barbara's proposal for the mission statement that he wrote a little while back, he separated this into infrastructure management and control plane management. So I think I'd like the change to control plane. And under infrastructure management, it was really, how do I set up my machines, and how do I, make them talk to each other? And so I think that includes things like configuring the kubelet. I would put that under the infrastructure management part as part of sort of like the machines API. Whereas the control plane management is really, when I run the Kubernetes control plane, how do I put the pieces together to actually make the control plane work?
Maybe we can combine the second last. Basically, say like Kubernetes tools used for cluster infrastructure management and the management of component configuration.
I mean, these last two, those are very distinct things. I'd like this. Right? This is very distinct in this.
But both of them talk about tools, I guess.
Yeah, there's many kind of tools. There's wrenches, there's knives, there's knife wrenches.
I'd like to make a suggestion. If there is and I understand your guys' explanation of the difference between the control plane and the infrastructure, can we put a definition section in just to define those?
We could just put a sub-bullet item below that.
Okay, yeah, that would be perfect.
This includes, right, Robbie, your turn.
Hold on, I'm trying to figure out where you're typing.
So normally when you add a sub-bullet, you have to have a good reason, like multiple sub-bullets. Otherwise, this has to be part of the same sentence, pretty much.
Well, the first one is totally fine. The second one needs qualification, and I'm okay with that too. And that also helps the scope statement as well. So.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think what I can copy and paste from Justin's, or if I have to wordsmith it. Hold on.
Put you under the gun. I need to open up while you're doing that, the governance doc.
Okay. Can we just change it to say infrastructure management and get rid of cluster here? Because I think cluster here does actually have a lot of overlap with managing the control plane. I think that when people think of the cluster half of this, they think of the control plane. And if we split those apart and say we manage the control plane and then we also manage the machines, those are sort of two separate efforts, or sort of two separate thrusts. I think that separation makes a lot of sense for people. And I'll paste Justin's thing in to start with, and people can look at that. And then we can, whoops, that's not what it is. This copy apparently did not work. There we go.
I think we should decouple from machines, however.
Explain more.
Like the machines are cluster API specific. I think we should be more broad about like the scope here. I'm not sure.
Yes, I agree. The machines API is cluster specific, but I think that the intent here was more, if you look at like the large number of projects that are configuring machines, they're sort of mostly related to or driven by people from this SIG, right? So the legacy CubeUp scripts were written by people in the SIG. COPS was written by people in the SIG. The CubeSpray and all of the other tools that people were building when they went through the Kubernetes incubation process, those were all sort of coming through SIG cluster lifecycle. And the cluster API is in some sense an effort to consolidate the thinking around how people manage their machines based on all of that experience, and does seem to fall pretty squarely within this SIG.
So if we present the term machines to the steering committee, are they going to understand it?
That's a good question. Depends on if they've read my KEP or not.
So I'm brand spanking new to everything that's going on here, and I have no idea what a machine is. I don't know if that helps, but.
So we picked the name machine so that it would be confusing with node, right? Because node is a term that's already using Kubernetes.
So is the machine just the bare metal?
Yeah, it's a physical or virtual machine.
Right.
And then if you take that machine and you run a kubelet on it, it becomes a node in your cluster.
Okay.
But there has to exist something to run the kubelet on underneath it, right?
We don't need to bike shed too much on this, but why don't we put like a why don't we put like a to-do marker here? Right. And so let's put a pin in that one and then loop back to it. I want to get this submitted this week if we can, and just so it's off of our to-do list, right? Tools that assist in management of Kubernetes component configuration. I didn't like the components configuration, even though it's grammatically correct. It just sounds terrible.
It's correct.
Yeah, okay. Code binaries and services. This one in the charter is a little weird.
Before you move on, Tim, one thing that is not covered here is add-ons. I think there's been at least some agreement that add-ons falls under SIG cluster lifecycle. What do people think about that?
Yes. That's not correct, Tim. It's beyond that. Well, I guess it is correct.
So we have a note about add-ons below, like in the next section, I think. Yeah, the SIG endorses third-party cluster add-ons.
Yeah, because it's not, this is a weird space. Like there are core add-ons, right? Like DNS. And then there are other add-ons like EFK, which are totally out of scope, right? So that's the cross-cutting portion. So I don't think we should put a stake in the ground here with regards to, there's no clearly defined layer for what is a core add-on and what is an extension or some other.
Yeah, I don't think we want to claim to own the add-ons themselves. It's more add-on management, or if we ever build one, an add-on API, right? In the same way that the API machinery team doesn't own Kubernetes APIs or the controllers for those APIs, but they own the API management infrastructure, and they make it possible for other people to write APIs, right? And so if we can reduce sort of the core control plane and make more things add-ons. So like you think like the Cloud Controller Manager being split out, like
Yes.
that should probably be run as an add-on.
But
you know, the
it's
networking
not
provider.
germane to us though. Like if the cloud controller would not fall underneath our purview.
No, but the team that is doing that wants to run it as an add-on, we should be providing a framework for them to turn it into an add-on easily.
Yeah, but the framework is Kubernetes itself.
I mean, potentially, right? And I think that's sort of up for debate. If you look at like the 2018 roadmap for our SIG that Lucas put together, he's got a bullet point that says add-ons API to do organize a meeting for this.
Yeah. Okay.
And somebody from Google, Jeff Johnson, is looking at this and said he was thinking about trying to propose a time for meeting with the SIG. He said June, but June's already gone, so maybe he means later this summer.
So why don't we? That's in the cross-cutting area. So like, why don't we? I don't necessarily want to put it in scope, and it affects a whole bunch of broader things.
Okay. Presumably we can mutate this later. So if there does become an add-ons API that we start driving, we can add it. And if add-ons is just use Kubernetes to, you know, kubectl apply-f things, then that's maybe not something we own explicitly.
Yep. The next section is ambiguous to me because it says code binaries and services. List what qualifies. Now the keyword here is qualifies a piece of code binary service. Now in that's, with that perspective, that's everything that's in scope. So it's kind of like, it's kind of redundant. We could just say something that says any binary, any non-UI based binary that falls within scope. Or do we want to include UI binary, or any binary that falls underneath the scope?
Yeah, I don't understand this section either.
You don't list the details here.
My understanding, the only binary we ship is kubeadm at the moment.
So again, the purpose of this section is, it's a little ambiguous. It's not to say the actual details. That should be stored in sigs.yaml of what binaries and artifacts are produced. The purpose of this statement is to say, like, when you're making a decision, like what are the criteria that you would use to say that this binary it falls underneath your purview? And I think the general statement should be, you know, as falling into the scope of the SIG, or like you have some generic statement that says it meets the criteria for in scope and out of scope work.
Yes, a single sentence. I can write that.
Isn't that true for all SIGs? Like, what's the purpose of this section? If everybody just says our code is things that meet the criteria of things that are in scope,
you might want to have qualifiers. The purpose here is to add qualifiers, like we will not do UIs, or we will not do certain other things, like to basically have boundary lines in the qualifiers.
Okay. Other than UI, are there any boundary lines that we need to put in?
I don't think UI is necessarily even a boundary line for.
Yeah, I don't know why we focus on that. Not that I'm signing up to write a UI, but I think the goal is to make things easier, and if UIs do that, then so be it.
Well, the problem with UIs is they have a tendency to conflate, right? You touch one thing and all of a sudden becomes a buckyball, and you're talking about everything under the sun.
Sure.
But the CLI is also an UI, so that's a bit of a conflict between the six, because the CLI is an user interface, essentially.
You might want to say here's a good place to add like core add-ons that are required for cluster operation.
Do we want to say cluster bootstrapping instead of operation? Because I mean, operation is very generic. You could say things like logging and monitoring are required for operation, but you certainly don't need those to get a cluster up and running.
I like it. I don't know how we refer to add-ons globally. Anything else?
I'd like to clarify something. Is that really true though? I mean, the cluster API is actually more of a library, and the individual vendor are responsible for building the controller and the CLI.
But that still falls under the purview of the SIG, the charter of the umbrella of the SIG.
I see.
So even though the provider has a home, a happy home within inside of the SIG, they're a sub-project and they're part of the broader umbrella.
Right, like each of the provider repos are brought up to this SIG for voting before we create the repositories.
So would you want to add that here, like provider specific implementations for cluster bootstrapping?
Or, I mean, it's kind of in a sub-bullet of the first line, right? Like tools for infrastructure management. So that could include provider specific tools for infrastructure management, right? Or provider specific implementations of infrastructure management. I mean, where they have sort of enough, support and momentum within the SIG to be maintained, right? I think that's why we vote and make sure that there are people that are going to maintain it and not just say, yes, we'll take every provider implementation that one person wants to build.
Okay. Any other constraints?
So Fabrizio is asking about HCD.
No, that's out of scope.
Okay.
Just because it's already laid claim. I honestly think it falls underneath our purview, but it's been laid claim by API machinery because there's a really tight coupling to the data model to the actual API machinery. So I'm fine with punting that out. Although history has taught me that it's really important. So
yes.
I'm moving on to the next section unless there's other comments that folks want to make.
So it's really unclear to me the code binaries and services and the 3 entries we added there, but I'm pretty sure that we are gonna get some feedback on these. And
this is not a list of the specific code locations or the projects that goes into SIG.YAML. So
yeah, but there's kind of overlapping with the in scope. I don't know.
It does. We can make that comment too, and I can bring that up with Philip.
Yeah, and I mean, if they want us to remove this, we are going to remove it. That's it.
Yeah. The SIG works closely with SIG release during the end of cycle because of how the release is currently managed. This process requires a lockstep coordination, which is outlined here. Right. And I can do the markdownification of it. Coordinate together with others in the community. What? Coordinate together with others in the community the path forward, making all Kubernetes components. This is Lucas's statement. Is it our responsibility, cross-cutting external
this is a temporary task. I mean, we're going to resolve this, and then this is no longer cross-cutting.
And we won't even own it because it'll be part of machinery.
Yes.
So I don't think this is a broader thing that we will continually maintain or do as part of our. I mean, if anything, nope.
Do we put stuff in here until this task is done and then remove it? Or do we not put it in here because we don't think it's a perpetual task?
Well, who's going to even do the work items? I don't think anyone from the SIG is signing up to do those work items. It's not even our responsibility, right? So I don't think it should be I don't want to get the phone call when somebody mucks a component configuration, and then now we're on the hook for all of the consequences of that.
Yeah, it's a temporary job. I mean, it's an effort from the community, but I don't think this should be part of the charter.
I agree. The SIG endorses third-party cluster add-ons for networking, network service, service discovery, and other.
I mean, please correct me. I wrote this.
You might just say, because it's comma sentence, etc. at the end. The SIG maintains the health check for container images for some add-ons that are required for cluster bootstrapping. While the SIG could provide support to users that have add-ons related issues, the SIG can decide to delegate issues to the add-on maintainers or other SIGs. That seems fair.
I mean, that's what I do when I triage issues in KubeADM.
Yeah.
You could probably make a similar statement about like upgrade tests, where at least historically, people have always come to our SIG and said, why is the upgrade test broken? And it's often not that the upgrade test is broken, but a feature is broken during upgrade. Mm-hmm. And we've tried to make the upgrade test more self-describing, saying the upgrade finished and the ingress test broke so that people can go directly to SIG networking. But again, people still sometimes tag us as well. Like I was going through the spreadsheet for 1.12 this morning, and there are a bunch of things that say SIG cluster lifecycle on them when it looks like it's really a different SIG that should be poked at.
So how do you want to phrase that?
I mean, I think that in a similar way of the previous one, I mean, I can take a stab at it if you want to keep going on to the next part.
Are there other cross-cutting concerns or processes that our SIG is responsible for?
Maybe something related to the cluster API.
But how is that generic external facing process?
I mean, with something about the cloud providers, perhaps.
I don't know what you're thinking there, Lubomir. I need more words.
Yeah, I'm just trying to fetch feedback from Robert, and perhaps if Chris was here, because I mean it's about the external facing interaction with the cloud providers. Perhaps something we can add about that. Well, let's see if Robert has a comment on that.
Okay, hold on. I'm trying to type this sentence real quick.
So again, this kind of has duplication with the out of scope section.
Okay, so you're saying, what about the cluster API? What in particular were you wondering if we should put here?
So Chris has a comment below about like implementations of the cluster API and cluster cutoff, and this is kind of about. I made a suggestion there. Should we outline the?
I see what you're saying.
The interactions with like the cloud providers in terms of derivative work.
Implementation details of the given provider specific implementation.
Yeah, we can make this into a broader statement about like if somebody forks one of the tools, we don't provide support for it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting actually that this is under out of scope, because in some ways I think cloud provider specific issues is actually in the cross-cutting issues, because if someone is creating a cluster, say on AWS or on GCP, and the cluster creation fails, then they're probably just going to come to us first, right? In the same way that like if kubeadmin fails, regardless of what the problem is, they come to us first. And as the Ramir put in the above statement, we end up having to sort of triage and often delegate those issues out. So I think that's likely to happen with the cloud provider issues as well, especially when you split out the cloud controller manager. If you create a cluster and your ingress rules aren't creating load balancers, or your services aren't creating load balancers, they're going to say, I created my cluster doesn't work. It's not necessarily going to be clear who they should be talking to. So I feel like that might end up being more of a cross-cutting issue than an out-of-scope issue.
I agree.
And similarly for the cluster API providers, we put above that those are in scope and they're owned by the SIG. So at some level, we have some responsibility for those. But most or all of them are also sort of co-owned by the cloud-specific SIG. So like the GCP one is co-owned by SIG GCP, and the OpenStack one is co-owned by SIG OpenStack. And so I think that again is a sort of a cross-cutting issue where it's sort of owned by both parties there.
I mean, I don't know how to phrase that.
Yeah, phrasing is always the hard part.
Yeah, we should. I mean, we should probably get back to this later. So, what is the absolute deadline for the charter? Like Friday or something?
No, but I wanted to make a hard stop on Friday, and then we can always update. I just want to get the wordsmithing done today for the most part, and then we can post something and then get feedback from steering.
So maybe Chris or Robert can finish this to do. I mean, because they know what's best here.
That's good. Now it's assigned to both of us.
Right. Out of scope. Node related issues, obviously, network related issues, UI related issues. Yeah, I would say Kubernetes control plane specific issues. We get a lot of stuff that is related to the control plane that has nothing to do with our configuration.
We definitely, previous in this exact same discussion, said that we would be willing to take on some UI issues if it came up. So I think we should be more specific about UI-related issues being out of scope.
Related issues that are not germane to cluster bootstrapping?
Yeah, non-cluster bootstrapping related UI issues, maybe?
Sure.
Oh, seems good. We might get feedback, but we're going to fix everything later. So this kind of overlaps with the node, I think, or in terms of the kubelet at least.
That is true.
Perhaps other Kubernetes control plane issues.
Why don't we do this?
Yeah, I can add the API server here, like seek API machinery stuff.
Sure.
Okay.
What other aspects of things are totally out of scope?
Do you want to say something about security?
No, because that does affect us. That would almost be in scope. Do we even have best practices here this year? Objectives to improve the deployment, configuration management, upgrades to every Kubernetes clusters according to best practices. I don't know. adding modifiers to the end sentences.
We can also turn it into 2 sentences. You want maybe just put a note in parentheses, like best practices. Because that I think is something that we are trying to help drive.
Yeah, because we are trying to, we that includes security in there.
We could put that in security in the section of cross-cutting issues, because I think generally we would work with SIG auth for identifying some of the security related best practices, setting secure by defaults for clusters, remediating issues we find. I think those folks from that SIG would almost certainly be involved. Also, if you think about things like node bootstrapping and the TLS bootstrapping stuff, that was all sort of a collaboration between lifecycle and SIG auth.
Feel free to wordsmith that one. This is good. It's painful, but good. It's not the funnest thing in the world to do. Are there other things that are out of scope we want to call out?
I mean, that's pretty good coverage.
Yeah. Roles in organizational management. The SIG adheres to blah, blah, blah. That's fine. That's a standard statement. Additional responsibilities of the chair. Continually groom the backlog for current milestone. Yeah, that's kind of in the responsibilities, but it's not really it's called out. Manage the release.
The backlog is ambiguous there, right? Because especially as we start splitting, we have multiple repos now. Is it the chair's responsibility to do all of the backlogs? Is it?
Oh gosh, yeah. That's maybe we want to remove that because it's impossible. We don't own all of that.
Well, I was looking below in the SIG. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Maybe the chair is responsible for selecting features for the current milestone.
There you go. But that's our, okay.
I mean, selecting features is like a defined Kubernetes thing, right? Like there's a big spreadsheet.
Yes.
I mean, that's a responsibility for all the SIG leads, I think.
It's fine. If they ask us to remove it, we'll remove it.
I was looking through the governance doc, and it looks like, so I think right now we just have chairs defined, but there's chair, tech lead, and sub-project owner. And for the sub-project owner, I think it's clear that the sub-project owner should be responsible for grooming the backlog for their sub-project. Mm-hmm. And maybe if we have sub-projects without owners that sort of roll up to the chair to then sort of inherit that responsibility. And it's up to the chair to make sure that the sub-projects have owners so that they don't have to do the backlog grooming.
I'm okay with this statement. If somebody pushes back, we'll eliminate, revise, or whatnot. Manage the release of the sub-projects of the SIG. Be responsible for that A release, or responsible for a release. Be responsible. This statement needs revising.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would also love for this to be pushed down and say it's not the chair's responsibility to do this; it's the sub-project owner, and we should just be more clear about the sub-project owners. I'd rather have the chair have fewer responsibilities and sort of delegate that responsibility down, especially as we have more sub-projects that the SIG is adopting.
Yeah.
It doesn't
I
make sense
agree.
for the chair to have to do this for all sub-projects. There's not a section in the template for additional responsibilities of tech lead or of sub-project owners, but maybe we could just add one of those.
I think there's an other, but I removed it. Deviations from SIG governance. Sub-project creation. Oh, I already did that. Sorry to take up the whole hour here, but this is actually fruitful and worthwhile.
Oh, that's Mark.
Yeah, try to use Markdown. Yeah.
Okay, whatever you just cut out of that other section, we should paste down here under this where I put releases. And we should probably go into our sub-project list in SIG.YAML and actually identify who the leads are for each of the sub-projects.
Yes. I'm fine with right now that the way it's for current phrasing. We can go back and revise it if we need to. The sub-project creation. Well, let's go back up here for a second. Are there any other responsibilities for the chair that are out of the norm from the SIG governance? I have chairs. Speaking of which, for this one, I will not be at Kubanium office hours tomorrow. I have an overlapping meeting that I have to go to, so I cannot run that meeting.
So who is going to record?
I can send Lubomir if you want to host. If you have topics that you want to discuss, I can send you the deets.
Well, we need to discuss the testing and the feature freeze, but that's KubeADM specific.
Okay.
So we can continue tomorrow essentially, but in the KubeADM office hours if everyone else agrees.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, but I'm not going to be there, so I can send you the deets.
Okay.
Are there other additional responsibilities?
I mean, for tomorrow, if we don't have quorum, I'm gonna cancel the meeting probably.
Okay.
Do we want to say something about organizing not necessarily running, but organizing like the breakout and deep dive sessions at the Kubernetes conferences?
I think that's worthwhile because it's a non-trivial. Yeah. Yep.
Anything else for chair responsibilities people can think of? All right, we might have lost Tim. We'll keep going. Additional responsibilities for tech leads. So right now, I don't think we actually have tech leads defined in SIGs.yaml. So if we want them to have additional responsibilities, we should probably define who they are.
I'm okay with just leaving it blank.
Do we want to move this up to chair responsibility then? Or do we want to just not worry about mentioning it?
So it depends who is considered a tech lead. Can you give me an example?
It's muddled in our SIG, so it's kind of a little bit of both, right?
Maybe we should remove this sentence then. Or
yeah, I think it's fine to leave that out and just say, basically that, maybe just leave it out altogether and say that in our SIG that job is crowdsourced. I think there are specific people that have been driving it in the past, but that doesn't mean other people can't step up and drive in the future without having to be sort of officially a tech lead, right?
It sounds good to me. I think we're fine the way it is. We're at T-minus 7 minutes to finish up here.
Okay, we're basically at the end now, right?
Yep. So we already mentioned deviations from SIG governance, that the SIG contains a number of subprojects and the SIG is empowered, is, tense, has empowered the subproject leads with a number of additional responsibilities. I might put a qualifier like including but not limited to.
Maybe that second one is actually two things. So I think the intent here is, we want the user experience to be good for people that are contributing, and we want the owners to sort of be on the hook for making sure that the contributor experience is good by addressing open PRs. So we don't want to have the number of open PRs just balloon. Older PRs are much harder to figure out how to merge. We have bots that people can turn on to help with both of these things, and the sub-project owner is responsible for making sure that those happen or that they do it manually.
You could put a qualifier there that says like, it's almost like you're the chair and tech lead for a sub-project. the code that resides underneath it, right? I don't know exactly how you'd phrase it, but you're basically stating the same responsibilities that are listed for the chair in the TL.
I mean, these are probably nice suggestions for improving the SIG governance document.
Yeah, I think that's fine too. We can probably leave it the way it is, and we'll, it doesn't need to be perfect. Consider this a living document that will be refined over time. This is the first draft.
I was going to ask at what periods of time the SIG charter is going to be revisited?
I don't know. We haven't set that up yet. I think the first pass is just to get it written down, because there needs to be a rationalization. We have too many SIGs. And we need to rationalize some of this by clearly defining what is in, what is out, and then I think over time there will be a second step of rationalization, which would be like, okay, we need more organizational structure around what are sub-projects and what are those roles, etc.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I think having maybe fewer SIGs and more sub-projects would make it a little bit easier for people to communicate across boundaries.
I also want to de-emphasize some of the political minefield that kind of exists, but I think that requires the steering committee to sort of promote this as a first level concept, that like, just because you're a sub-project doesn't mean you're somehow demoted, right? Like, it actually empowers you to have more autonomy in several respects. So I think there needs to be some social foo, for lack of a better word, that accompanies some of this stuff as people make these changes. But I'm totally okay with the way it is currently right now, and then slowly adjusting over time the vernacular and the roles and responsibilities for other aspects of this stuff.
Yeah, so we have a couple of to-dos in the draft, and then we can pretty much be ready to send it as PR. I was going to ask, should we include like the 6 YAML changes?
We should do that independently. The SIG YAML changes should not accompany the charter. They're totally independent. So we should, if somebody wants to take on point to adjust the SIGs.YAML file and to update that would be great. 1, 2, 3, not it. I drove the charter here, so getting this going took enough.
Which parts of SIG.YAML do we think really need to be? I mean, it'd be nice to put owners on sub-projects. We can try to ping people who created sub-projects and ask them to add the correct owners, because I don't know if anybody knows who all those people are. Which other parts do we think you need updating? I think we already have a decent list of links to sub-projects.
I mean, the tech leads have to be, like you said, but I mean, I'm going to take a look at it, but my problem is that I don't know what to change in there. Like, I don't know who is a sub-project lead and stuff like that.
I can take a swipe at it. Somebody put an action item in the agenda, just so I have a note as SIG cluster lifecycle agenda, and then action item and assign it to me, just so I have a reminder to go back to it. It won't take long.
Okay.
Right,
I guess each of the subprojects already has a link to owners based on code location, so maybe we don't need to do anything for owners there.
We are at time though, so. Well, thanks everybody for wordsmithing. I think it was helpful and informative. Hopefully those who are new to this whole SIG cluster lifecycle business kind of get an insight into some of the what we're responsible for and not responsible for. And with that, I think we'll call it. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, bye.